Mr. President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
I'd ask unanimous consent that we eviscerate the quorum call.
Without objection.
It's my honor to represent my family, my neighbors, and the millions of people in my very diverse state in Oklahoma. I'm an ordinary Oklahoman. I don't come from a prominent political family or any kind of political machine. My wife of 23 years, Cindy, is here in the chamber today. We walked through life together, raised two incredible girls who love God and love our nation. Stepping into this body was a high cost for my family, but we took this on together. We have a tremendous staff, both here in Washington, D.C. and in Oklahoma, who have sacrificed incredible time and energy for the future of our nation. Every day, they work incredibly hard to solve the issues that we face as a nation. I'm grateful to serve in this chamber, and for this to be my very first time to be able to speak in this chamber. And a few issues that I want to just be able to raise and address in our conversation today. I had the opportunity to be able to live in a heritage of distinguished Oklahomans who have served in this chamber. I serve alongside Senator Jim Inhofe, who has stood for conservative principles in this body for 2 decades. I'm humbled to follow the irreplaceable Dr. Tom Coburn, who, for those of us that are Dallas Cowboy fans, my coming here is kind of like being Danny White after Roger Staubach. There have been 17 other senators from Oklahoma, great names like Don Nichols, Henry Bellman, Robert S. Kurd, David Boren, Mike Maroney, to name just a few. I have the honor to sit at the same desk on this chamber floor used by fellow Republican senators Tom Coburn, Dewey Bartlett, and Edward Moore. In the 1930s, Oklahoma's favorite son and humorist Will Rogers said, "Congress is so strange. A man gets up to speak and says nothing, nobody listens, and then everybody disagrees." This is my first official moment to join the ranks of those who step up to speak, but I want to speak about a few things that I consider essential to the work ahead for all of us. It's what I call the 3 Ds that I talk about all the time: debt, defense, and directives. Let me take those in reverse order. The directives. People ask me all the time, what do Oklahomans want from their federal government? The answer is simple. They want to be left alone. They do not want someone else over 1,000 miles away telling them what to do, how to run their business, and how to run their lives. It's not that people in Oklahoma are anti-government, far from it. We have a strong patriotism that drives us to serve our nation and honor those who give their lives to public service. 20 years ago, Oklahoma and the nation was devastated by a truck bomb in the Oklahoma City Federal Building, killing 168 people, most of those federal employees. We are grateful for people in government who serve faithfully every day. But we also understand that our federal government has a task, and it also has a territory. Federal officers should do their task efficiently, with great transparency and accountability, but they should also stay out of other people's tasks and do theirs with great effectiveness. When I step into a restaurant, I may have an idea for a new recipe, but I can't just wander back in the kitchen and start cooking and changing the way the restaurant works. Neither can a federal regulator drift into every business and decide they're going to redo how that business is done. That's not their territory. That's not their job. But today in America, if you want to start or run a business, that you'll find out that the government has already made most of the decisions for you about how you'll run your business. One of my Oklahoma companies recently paid a fine for not reporting to a federal agency that they had nothing to report. Now, I'm fairly confident that the Founding Fathers, when they were envisioning a country of the people, by the people, for the people, were not envisioning that citizens of the country would pay fines to their government for reporting they have nothing to report. In the past weeks, I've started a bipartisan initiative called the Cut Red Tape Initiative to try to identify ways to streamline government, to return decisions back to individuals and local governments and clear the clutter of regulations that benefit the government but slow down business. Just so people would know that this process is difficult, I have faced weeks of red tape here in the Senate to start an initiative called Cut Red Tape. We'll work through that. In the past few years, over 30,000 pages have been added to the Federal Register. Nothing in American life doesn't face a federal regulation. To make sure government considers the cumulative effect of all these regulations, agencies are required to do a regulatory look back to evaluate problem regulations each year, but most don't take it seriously. The Department of Labor has 676 regulations and rules. This year, their regulatory look back includes 4 regulations. 4 of 676. That's not a serious review. The new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has no accountability to the American people, and it has no limit to its authority. They are becoming a fourth branch of government with no checks or balances. The EPA spends their time looking for gray areas of law in places where they can reinterpret old laws to fit their new agenda. Consent decrees and novel interpretations of statutes have superseded consistent rulemaking in statutory and state primacy of enforcement. Agencies now write rules, interpret their rules, enforce their rules, and establish the punishment for not following their rules. Many people want to blame this administration. I disagree. This administration's become experts at pushing the boundaries, that's true. But the rise of the regulatory state is not new. For decades, the Congress has delegated responsibilities to agencies and given them very few boundaries. Since the 1970s, in the Chevron case, the courts have increased the power of the regulatory agencies by allowing them to have deference to determine their own rules. This isn't a Republican or Democrat issue. It's an American issue, which will not improve until this body demands their constitutional authority back and clarifies to the court that the Constitution states that all legislative authority shall lie in a Congress, not in an agency. The American people want to give the federal government their own directive. Leave us alone. Now, I'm willing to work with anyone who's willing to work on some of these issues. So far this session, I've co-authored or co-sponsored bills and worked with ideas with Ted Cruz, Elizabeth Warren, Gary Peters, John Cornyn, Heidi Heitkamp, Dianne Feinstein, Orrin Hatch, Mike Lee, Steve Daines, Tim Scott, Rob Portman, Tom Carper, Angus King, Rand Paul, Janine Shaheen, John McCain, Mike Enzi, Kelly Ayotte, Mark Kirk, and Ron Johnson, just to name a few. I didn't have to sacrifice my conservative values, but I did have to admit that anyone can have a good idea. And just because we disagree on one thing doesn't mean I have to belittle people. I told my wife several years ago, when I first came into the House of Representatives, I had this deja vu moment, thinking I've felt this way before, but I've never been in politics or in Congress. But I know this feeling. And after about 6 months, I called her and I said, I finally figured out what this feeling is to be in Congress. It's the emotion you have in middle school lunch. It's that feeling of, I get more popular by sitting at my table and making fun of everyone else at everyone else's table. And if I ever say something nice about someone else at another table, my table shakes their head and says, why would you do that? But if I ever say something unkind, everybody says, way to go. Welcome to Congress. Only we can turn this around. We will strongly disagree on areas, but we should find the areas of common ground where we don't have to sacrifice our values and to be able to find ways to work together. Second issue, defense. Directives and defense. Our freedom is foreign to most of the world, and it's a threat to them. Not because the United States is an aggressor nation, far from it, but because the liberty we export is so powerful, they know well it could depose their dictatorships and weaken their control. Many government leaders around the world would rather keep their people poor and closely managed than allow them to be prosperous and free. Iran is on the rise. Since the 1979 revolution, Iran has exported terrorism around the world, and I am convinced that some individuals, even in this administration, trust Iran's words more than they trust history, the facts on the ground, or even their own intuition. We cannot allow the largest exporter of terrorism in the world to have nuclear weapons. We cannot do that. Dictatorial governments around the world and totalitarian Islamic leaders consistently test our mettle, probe our infrastructure and computer systems, test our passion for freedom and our resolve for the dignity of every person. By the way, that's one of our core values. Every person, even people we disagree with, are valuable. It's why the issue, just as a side note, of race is so important to us in America. Because we understand in many parts of the world, if you're from the wrong family, the wrong tribe, the wrong race, the wrong faith, you cannot get a job, you can't get government services, you can't get housing, all those things. That's how other places do it. That's not us. We have chosen to not be like that as a nation. Where injustice exists, we want to bring freedom and equality within our own boundaries or around the world. We believe every person is created equal and is endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Every person. When brutal thugs attack innocent nations, we have the moral high ground to call out the aggressor and to stand with the oppressed. We always work with resolve to solve the issues peacefully. We understand the proverb, a gentle answer turns away wrath. Our diplomacy leads the way. But when nations and philosophies will not stop their aggression, they learn that we do not bear the sword for nothing. I have the privilege, and I do count it as a privilege, of serving thousands of men and women and their families who faithfully protect our nation every day in all branches of the military, first responders on our streets, in the intelligence community, at our ports, in the air, training, equipping, and protecting. Hundreds of thousands in Oklahoma. In fact, without Oklahoma, just so this body will know, our nation could not sustain our Air Force, train our pilots, rearm our munitions, fire artillery or rockets, talk to our subs, train our young soldiers, refuel our aircraft, control battlefield airspace, or deliver supplies. So you're welcome for what happens in Oklahoma every day. Our Guard and Reserve units have fulfilled everything that has been asked of them by their nation, some of them to their last full measure of devotion. But in Oklahoma, our patriotism also challenges us to deal with military waste when it takes money, especially directly from the warfighter. Why would we call waste in defense patriotism? Let's solve it. We want the intelligence community to be well equipped. We want them to be attentive to the issues around the world, but we also want our Fourth Amendment freedoms protected. Remember, Oklahomans like to just be left alone. Third issue, our debt. Directives, defense, and debt. Our economy runs on increasing debt. That's how we're actually managing life day to day nowadays. We gamble every year that interest rates will not go up and the rest of the world will still want our bonds. This year, we paid $229 billion in interest payments. Think about that for a minute. $229 billion. The Highway Trust Fund is short just $10 billion, and we're spending $229 billion just in interest payments this year. CBO estimates that we will spend over $800 billion in interest payments by the end of the 10-year window. That's more than we spend on all defense spending, education, transportation, and energy combined. We'll do just in interest payments in the days ahead. We need to fix two things in this budget hole: efficiently manage federal spending and a growing economy. Duplication in programs. All these things need to be resolved. Let me take a couple of these things. Efficiency in the federal government. We need to deal with the tremendous fraud and waste and duplication. Where we see it, we should go after it. For the past 2 weeks, I've held a bill that funds a grant program for bulletproof vests. I'm not opposed to the program. I'm opposed to the fact that we have two programs that do the same thing. Two different applications, two different sets of processes, two programs that do the same thing. We see it. We should solve it. Yesterday, we marked up and passed a bill in a committee that I authored called the Taxpayer Right to Know Act that will identify duplicative programs, the administrative costs, the number of full-time staff, and how and if programs are evaluated. It's a common sense thing to do that passed by voice vote out of the committee. And in the days ahead, I hope we'll use that tool wisely to be able to actually identify where we have duplication, and instead of complain about it, we solve it as a body. The goal is to find those and eliminate them. A friend of mine in Oklahoma who's an ex-Marine, his name is Hank. Hank runs a small business. Hank is a guy that if you see him, you need to brace yourself, because when he shakes your hand, you know it. Hank runs his small business from a desk in his unair-conditioned garage. When I think about the way that we spend money, I often think of Hank. Hank is not a guy who wants to have our government suffer or our nation do something weak. Hank is an incredible patriot, but he wants us to spend money wisely. And where we find waste, he would expect that we would get rid of it. He does. He would expect that we do. Good example of that may be Social Security disability. It's a difficult issue for us to talk about because we want a safety net for the truly vulnerable. But we all know that there's incredible waste in that program, and there are people that are ripping off the system. To have a strong safety net for the vulnerable doesn't mean that we allow people to freeload off the top. Disability is designed for people who cannot work in any job in the economy, not someone who just doesn't want to. Let's find a way to protect the vulnerable, but incentivize those that are freeloading off the system to engage back into work. We need people to work. The Earned Income Tax Credit is another one of those. We know, we read the reports every year, 24% fraud rate, highest fraud rate in the federal government. Last year, $14.5 billion in loss. One program, $14.5 billion. We've got to pay attention to this. We've got to get the economy going or we'll never fix the debt. We can't just fix it by reducing spending. We all know that well. Tax reform seems to be the elusive dream of our economy. I can only hope that as a body, we won't continue to strive for large-scale tax reform and fail to do some things that are significant and possible. Banking reform must be done. Dodd-Frank is choking out lending. Now, I don't want to attack any individual that voted for it, but I am very well aware there are many unintended consequences that have come down, especially on community banks. People can feel our economy tightening and the lending tightening. They don't know why. Main Street community banks are dealing with uncertain regulations. We have to get our community banks back in business. We can do that by exempting traditional banks from heavy regulatory burdens that complex banks face and replacing simple capital requirements. This isn't controversial or complicated. We just need to work on some simple things while we still work on the complex. Trade. We're a nation that believes in trade. Quite frankly, our Navy was created in the infancy of our republic to protect our trade. In fact, one of the grievances that we had with King George in the original Declaration of Independence was the king was cutting off our trade with all ports of the world. Trade has been a big deal to us as a nation since before we were a nation. Currently, this ongoing debate about whether we'll be a nation of trade seems a little odd to me. Yes, we're going to be a nation of trade. We always have been. Let's work it out, and let's continue to grow our economy. Energy issues. The past 6 years, the brightest star in our economy has been energy. If we want to have the economy grow, energy is going to be a major part of that formula. If anyone disagrees with that, I'd love to get a chance to meet them, because I can show you all the job growth that's happened in America just circled around energy. But we all know EPA policies make energy development harder and increase the cost of everything for every person in America. Energy jobs are great paying jobs, but they're suddenly fading away because of this mixture of low oil prices and bad energy policy. A few years ago, America was led to believe they were running out of oil and gas, and our supplies were going away. Now our supplies are at record numbers, and we keep finding more. In the past 6 months, America has lost 100,000 jobs because we've stopped drilling, because our tanks are full and the prices have collapsed. If we could only sell that oil, what a difference that might make to our economy. You see, we can sell our coal and we can sell our natural gas, but for whatever reason, we as a nation are still thinking we can't sell oil. Now, we could sell gasoline, just not oil. It'd be kind of like saying you could sell flour, but you can't sell wheat. Currently, we import about 27% of our crude. Most of that's heavy oil. That's imported. Most of that is done by foreign ownership of refineries. They're bringing in their own oil. Most of our new finds are in light sweet oil, a different type of oil that our refineries don't need. You know who needs it? Mexico needs it. Canada needs it. So literally, while our storage tanks are at maximum capacity and the prices continue to drop in America, the rest of the world is craving our oil, and we're debating on whether that's a good idea. It's the ultimate irony that right now the administration's in negotiations to open up the sale of Iranian oil to the world market, and we can't sell oil from America on the world market. Let's pay attention to American jobs. Let's get our economy going. There's some basic things that we can do. All this talk about security, economy, and liberty all still boils down to one thing, though: our families. Nothing is bigger in our nation than our families. Nothing. We're not a nation of wealth. We're a nation of families. The rise of government is directly connected to the collapse of families. It's not that government's pushing down families, it's that families are collapsing and government's trying to rise to fix that. It won't fix it. Government can't fix a family, but we can make sure there's no marriage penalty in our tax law. We can make sure that we don't incentivize broken families in our social welfare programs. We can actually use our moments and our times when we speak to state the obvious. America's strongest when American families are strong. Let's not be afraid to step out and protect what we know works. We don't live in a nation with no hope. We live in a nation of incredible hope. The seeds are all still there. It's a matter of how much we're going to engage in those things, whether we're going to be an exporter of freedom and of our basic values. It's what I think we should do. We should export our freedom to the world. We should export our values to the world. And we'll do that at our best as we protect our families and as we rise up and speak about the things that we know are right. There's a tremendous diversity of American opinion. We're free to speak, but before the framers even mentioned free speech, they mentioned the free exercise of religion. It's popular in culture now for people to be intolerant of people of faith and people who live their faith. You can say you have faith, but you're pushed down if you actually practice the faith that you say you have. I served for 22 years in ministry before I came to Congress. I have a little different perspective than some in that. I see our nation with a great spiritual hunger. I don't criticize Washington, though, in the process. Quite frankly, I believe Washington perfectly reflects our culture. And people that are frustrated with what Washington has become, I remind them, this is who we are as a nation. What are we going to do about it becomes the big issue. What are we going to become? While we beat ourselves up, we lose track that the rest of the world still looks at us. And they still want to be us. Last September, I was in Central America for a few days, meeting with some of the leaders there, talking about immigration. I don't know if anyone's noticed, there are a few issues with immigration right now. As we had this conversation about immigration, I started talking about what are we going to do and how are we going to limit the number of these unaccompanied minors coming in and what's actually driving them to come. And one of the leaders there said, "Sir, I don't know if you've noticed, but you're the United States of America. Everyone in the world wants to come there. There doesn't have to be a driving factor to go to your nation. Everyone wants to be your nation." Now, we don't have open borders, nor should we. But it was another lesson learned that while we argue among ourselves, we have the opportunity to be able to serve in the greatest nation and the greatest body in the world. We still lead the world with our values. We should represent that well. That's our greatest export, our values. This is the National Day of Prayer. And I thought it'd be entirely appropriate to be able to end this conversation with both a reminder to call our nation to prayer, to remember Psalm 46, 1 and 2, that God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in time of trouble. Therefore, I will not fear. To not only remember that, but Mr. President, for me to actually call this Senate to pray. Let's pray together. Father, I pray for our nation. I pray that you would give us wisdom and direction. I pray for this body, incredible men and women who've set aside their families and their careers and their life to come serve their nation. I pray that you would give us unity of attitude and diversity of opinion, and that you give us the capacity to be able to solve the issues ahead of us. I pray for President Obama, for Vice President Biden, for the Supreme Court, for the House of Representatives, for the men and women around the world right now that are serving us quietly and in ways in intelligence, publicly as first responders and leaders, and our military scattered across the earth. God, would you protect them? And would you allow us as families and as leaders to represent you and the values of our nation to a world that needs our leadership still? God, use this time. Use us. As broken as we are, we know that you are an ever-present help in a time of trouble, and we will not fear. Thank you, Jesus. Amen. With that, Mr. President, I yield back.
Madam President.
Majority Leader.
Let me just say to our new colleague from Oklahoma, what an insightful assessment of the challenges facing our country, and an extraordinary list of solutions to those challenges, and not to mention reminding us all that we are the envy of the world. And so I congratulate our new colleague from Oklahoma, wish him well, and thank him for his fine remarks.